Well, I guess the real test is that it's edible enough for your wife to want to use it for her salami sandwich. So it definitely passes that test. It's not as though it's not edible. Hey guys, I'm Duncan, and if you're anything like me, there are two things that you probably do every single day. Drink coffee and eat bread. Now, that got me thinking, what happens if you combine those flavors together to make coffee bread? This is gonna be nothing like the coffee cake that you may be thinking of that is light, fluffy, sugary, and sweet. I'm trying to go for something that is dark, bitter, nutty, and earthy. So let's get started. The first step in making this bread is going to be making our coffee. And there are two key considerations to keep in mind while making our coffee for our bread. The first is that caffeine actually kills yeast, so we're gonna wanna use decaf coffee. And the second is that yeast needs to be in a pH controlled environment. So it's okay for yeast to be in a non-neutral pH environment, but it actually starts to die at a pH that goes below 4. But interestingly, actually does better in slightly acidic environments versus being in a neutral environment. So we are gonna want to take our decaf coffee and just make sure that it is at a neutral pH between 7 and 4. To make my coffee with the right flavor profile and pH balance, I went with 425 grams of water to 5 tablespoons of ground coffee. Now that we have our coffee ready, let's start making our Poolish. For our Poolish, we're gonna take 250 grams of flour, incorporate 1/16 of a teaspoon of yeast into that, just gently mix that together. And then we're going to add to that 250 grams of our decaf coffee at about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're just gonna mix that all together and incorporate it, and then leave it aside overnight for 12 to 14 hours to relax and ferment. Great, so now that you guys are all caught up with me, here is the Poolish that I made. Now, other than being a slightly funny brown color from the coffee, it actually looks really good. So this is the result of leaving the Poolish to ferment for about 12 to 14 hours. So now we're gonna take our decaf coffee flavored Poolish and start to incorporate that into our final mix to get ready to make our bread. In a large bowl, I have 250 grams of flour. I'm going to add to that 3/8 of a teaspoon of yeast. Now we're going to incorporate those two together gently. And next we're going to auto-lease our dough by adding our Poolish into our flour, incorporating this mixture, letting it sit for about 20 minutes. That will allow the gluten structure to start to form without the presence of salt. Then we'll add the salt and the remaining coffee and let our dough do its bulk ferment. I will note that this Poolish smells pretty strange. It's got the strong vinegary characteristics of Poolish with the coffee flavor. It almost smells like Kahlua. All right, hands are wet and ready. We're just gonna start incorporating the Poolish in the flour here. Now, because of the hydration level of the Poolish only being at about 50% of the total hydration of the recipe, there's just not enough water in the Poolish right now for it to incorporate all of the flour, but I've gone ahead and incorporated as much of our flour as possible into our Poolish. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this ferment for another 20 minutes in auto-lease before coming back to incorporate the remaining coffee and the salt. So note to self that that did not work at all. Auto-leasing Poolish with flour is a no-go. So don't do that. "20 minutes later, and we're now ready to incorporate the remaining coffee and our salt into our Poolish and flour combination. So here I have 150 grams of roughly 100 degree, well, it's cooling down pretty fast, but it was roughly 100 degree decaf coffee. So I'm going for an 80% hydration dough here. So already in the Poolish was 250 grams of my decaf coffee. I'm adding in another 150 grams here to bring the total to 400 grams of liquid. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and also incorporate my 10.5 grams of salt. And we are going to mix by hand to combine. Just gonna gently fold over, incorporate the liquid, keep doing that, and we will check back in once this is all incorporated together into a nice dough. All right, so I've been working on incorporating this, and I'm not really sure what happened, but I have some strands of really tough dough in a very liquidy mixture. Something has gone terribly wrong here. So I'm not sure that this is gonna work. Like I said, I've got this really tough dough here that you can see, and then a bunch of goopy liquid that is not incorporating together. So I'm gonna keep trying to see what I can do here, but it does not seem like this is going to work. Okay, yep, this isn't gonna work. I'm writing this off, and I'm gonna start with something different, because this is just a stringy mess. Okay, so here's my theory about what went wrong. I think because of the more acidic mixture in the Poolish initially when it was resting overnight, the yeast would have been more active than it would have otherwise been with water. So that Poolish was actually overdeveloped, and there was too much gluten structure in there. And then by adding that Poolish into the flour and letting it autolyse, I actually encouraged it to create an even more rigid gluten structure. So by the time I was trying to incorporate my final liquid and salt, I'd already created way too rigid of a gluten structure, which caused those stringy strands that you saw. So I am going to start over. I am adamant to do two things. To one, make a coffee bread, and two, make that bread with Poolish. So I am going to start over. I'm gonna whip up another coffee-based Poolish now. I'm gonna check in with it earlier in the process this time, and you will see me later tonight when I'm trying again to mix this Poolish into the final mix to create the bread. Okay, my fresh batch of Poolish is now all set and ready to go, so we are good to start on making this second attempt at the coffee bread. I have 250 grams of flour in my large bowl. To that, I'm gonna go ahead and add my 10.5 grams of salt. Mix that in gently. Then I'm gonna add my 3/8 of a tablespoon of, is it a tablespoon? Now I'm gonna go ahead and add to that my 3/8 of a teaspoon of yeast. Great. Mixing that together. Now I have my 150 grams of 100-degree decaf coffee, incorporating that into my Poolish. Now all of this is going into my flour, yeast, and salt combination. Okay, putting all flashbacks of failure out of my mind, I'm gonna go ahead and incorporate this until we have a stable and well-combined dough. You can already see this is working a lot better. I think that I just got my timings way off last time, and the gluten was totally overdeveloped, and so then when I tried to add the additional liquid, it just was not having it. It was already too set in its structure and did not want to incorporate any more ingredients, no matter what I had to say about it. But this time around, adding everything right after setting the Poolish, I think it is looking like it's going to work. Okay, now that the dough is all mixed, this looks much more like what we were going for. I don't know what that monstrous creation I made last time was, but this is gonna be the dough that we're gonna go with. This definitely looks much more usable. We're gonna now let it start doing its final proof, so we will give it 20 minutes, come back, fold it, give it 20 minutes, do that again for the next 2 to 3 hours. Then I'm going to shape it, let it rest, and then put it into the proofing basket and let it proof in that basket overnight to take final shape, and then bake it tomorrow morning. Two hours later, and the dough has finished doing its bulk proof. Every 20 minutes or so, I gave it a fold. And so now that it's fully proofed, it's time to flip it out onto our board and then get it into shape, let it do a bench rest, and then we're gonna put it into our proofing basket and let it sit in the fridge overnight before we bake it first thing tomorrow morning. To start off with, we're just gonna turn the dough out of the bucket and onto our work surface. now that the dough is on our board, we're just gonna flour our hands and then start working the dough over itself again until we have a nice ball. All right, now that we have our dough loosely into a very sticky ball, we're just gonna let it relax here for about 10 minutes, and then we're gonna get it up and put it into our proofing basket to start taking shape. Now the bench rest is done, it's time to get this dough into the proofing basket so we can let it sit in the fridge overnight to take on its final shape. Now, I've noticed that this dough is a little stickier than I was expecting, and I'm honestly having a little bit of a harder time working with it than I thought I would. So I'm just gonna use an ample amount of flour to try and make sure it's not sticking to me and see what we can do. Okay. Over and come on, there we go, nice. Try and get this bottom piece now up and over. Yeah, this doesn't look very good. It's definitely better than the spaghetti mess I made before, but it's pretty sloppy. At this point, I'm just gonna rely on my scraper to try and help me get this off the board and into my proofing basket. So, try and cut some flour under it and then just get it up. Come on. You can do it. Okay, not the prettiest thing in the world right now, but I'm hoping that the magic will happen tomorrow when it's in the oven, and hopefully we get a really great result when we pull it out. So now that it is in the basket, we're just gonna stick this in the fridge overnight, and then we'll come back to it tomorrow when we are ready to put it into the oven to bake. Our coffee bread loaf has spent the night refrigerating. Here it is. Grew a lot in there. So now that our Dutch oven is heated up to 500 degrees, we're gonna tilt this loaf out onto the bench, then transfer it very carefully into the Dutch oven and let this bake. First, we're just gonna tip it out onto the workstation. Oh, it's sticky. Uh-oh, this isn't good. Come on. This has never happened to me before. And yeah, there we go. Okay, well, it released in the end. Now I'm gonna move this over, bring the hot Dutch oven over here, pop this in, score it, and put it in the oven. Hot, 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 hot. Dutch oven is nice and hot. Get some flour. All right. Here we go. That does not look very nice. Gonna score it if I can. Come on. This is, wow, look how much it's bubbling up already in there. I better get this lid on and get it in the oven. I'm very curious to see what this is gonna look like. Drop the heat down to 450 and let it sit in there for half an hour, and then we'll come back and take the lid off. "30 minutes in, lid comes off, and back in the oven. "15 to 20 more minutes. Well, here it is, our magnificent coffee bread. I'm gonna get it out onto the rack so it can cool. I'm very curious to cut into this to see what it tastes like. It looks like we had a little blowout on the side from cooking. I'm not sure what would have happened there to cause that. I'll have to try and figure that out. Definitely not the nicest looking loaf of bread, but I guess the proof will be in the taste, so gonna come back to this once it's cooled down and give it a try. Yep, I'd say that's some pretty cool looking bread, so let's cut it up and give it a try. All right, time to find out if all of this effort was worth it. Ooh, well, I like the color. It's nice and dark, almost like a whole wheat bread. Oh, I forgot to do a crunch check. It's definitely got a nice crunchy crust. I'm really struggling to taste the coffee, other than it tasting pretty acidic. So there's definitely a sour taste to it, but it's not really noticeable as a taste of coffee, just sort of sour. And there's a little bit of almost a burnt taste, which I guess is from the dark roast of the beans. So it's not bad, but it's definitely a different taste to a normal bread, kind of acidic and burnt. Let's cut a proper slice and see how the crumb looks on the inside. Given all the mishaps with shaping and everything else, I'm actually pretty impressed with how even the crumb looks on the inside and pretty happy with it. When I was tasting it, you could definitely tell it's a chewy, light, but also very hearty crust. So I'm actually pretty happy with the texture of the bread. The taste is a bit funny. It's not bad, but it's not what you would expect from bread, but I guess it could be what you'd expect from coffee bread. I guess it depends what you were expecting. It does smell like coffee, which is actually kind of nice. It's a nice smell, kind of the, yeasty, bready smell with coffee. That's not bad. Yeah, now that I've had a few more bites of it, to be honest, it's kind of hard to tell other than the smell and the color that there's coffee in here at all. So even though I replaced all of the water with coffee and did it at 80% hydration, it's very hard to get any coffee flavor in this bread. So bearing that in mind, it's kind of hard to say that all the extra effort was worth it in terms of checking the pH and making sure that everything was balanced, and also working with the acidity and all the difficulties that presented with the yeast and the gluten forming and that nightmare that we're just gonna brush over. Closing thoughts would be that it probably wasn't worth it. So I'm not gonna be able to highly recommend making coffee bread, but it tastes fine, it's good bread, it just probably wasn't worth the effort that it took to make it.
Pretty moist.
You don't taste the coffee though, right? Like, if I didn't tell you that this was coffee bread, would you know that there was coffee in it?
You can smell it. It's good. Oh.
What? Oh, you wanted your salami?
Where's my salami?
Well, I guess the real test is if it's edible enough for your wife to want to use it for her salami sandwich. So it definitely passes that test. It's not as though it's not edible.